want to turn here initially to the anniversary here that is quite significant. 2 years since the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States. So I also forgot to say at the outset of the show, if you're watching on Free Speech TV, shout out to you. Shout out to the FSTV team for making it possible for us to be here. But getting into the show, 2 years since Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States. Very momentous situation for the African continent, and a lot to look forward to, I think, in terms of what it could mean for the continent moving forward. And we are very, very honored to be joined for this show by Jonis Ghedi-Alasow, who is the director and coordinator of Pan Africanism Today, to talk more about all of this. Jonis, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and hello to you, hello to your viewers. It's a big pleasure to be here.
Well, great to have you here, of course. And as I mentioned at the outset, this week, 2 years since the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States. And I think there's a lot of people who have maybe only heard about the region through some of the basic headlines, the so-called coup belts and so on and so forth. So I was hoping you could just give a little background, what gave rise to the Alliance of Sahel States and what it really represents for the people in these countries.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I think it's an important question, and it's the right place to start, because the biggest problem with this kind of narrative of coup belts, or this idea that there are these people in these countries being held hostage by a bunch of soldiers, which is a dominant idea that we've come across in a lot of the kind of mainstream media, is that it completely writes the actual people out of history. Because the truth is what we are dealing with in the Sahel is, and especially in the AES, are people that are coming into the streets and quite assertively supporting the decisions that have been made by their new governments to effectively say that the country that we are living in must be a country where the future is decided in Bamako and in Niamey and in Ouagadougou, and not in Paris and Brussels and London. So to contextualize what is unfolding there today, you have to go back a little bit and understand that this is really a domino effect from the destruction of Libya by NATO, which resulted in complete destabilization of the region. It resulted in a huge increase of insurgent activity around the Sahel. And importantly, the second element of this development, beyond the complete destruction and illegal war on Libya by NATO, is that you had France intervene in the Sahel in the name of so-called peace. But we know now that in the 10 years that France was bringing peace to the Sahel, they were increasing the number of people dying thanks to insurgent activity by more than 2,000%. In other words, the complete destabilization of that region is the product of imperialist wars by NATO, imperialist interventions by France, and really it was about creating complete destabilization of the region. And people for 10 years have been protesting against this reality. They have been saying those governments that were in power there up until 2 years ago or 3 years ago in some cases need to go and need to change that, or need to change direction. So what we are seeing there today and what it means to the people, not just symbolically, but in concrete terms, is really a shift away from being the kind of stooges of neocolonialism and imperialism to a reality where, at least for better or for worse, the decisions about what direction those countries are going to be going into is being made by those countries. And here we cannot understand that by looking at coups. We can only understand that by the thousands and thousands of people in the streets of these countries who are supporting the trajectory that these countries are now on after 500 years of colonialism, of slavery, and of neocolonialism.
No, for many decades, Western powers, and in particular France, have extracted the Sahel's wealth while leaving the region in deep poverty. So can you tell us, how has that history of neocolonial plunder shaped the conditions people are living under today? And how is the AES trying to break from that cycle?
Sure. I think the best place to start in responding to this question is by creating a contrast, which is that in Niger, up until recently, 80% of the population has no access to electricity. At the same time, as 80% of the Nigerian population doesn't have access to electricity, every third light bulb in France is being powered by uranium taken out of Niger. That is in a nutshell, the reality we are confronted by. Now, this is again doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from 500 years of slavery, of colonialism, of neocolonialism. It comes from the fact that and we know this, that resistance exists anywhere where there is oppression and exploitation. So there has been a fight against the kind of subordination of the African people and the African continent since the day that people started doing that. But there has not been the same level of success in achieving all of the objectives of the historic national liberation struggles. And countries such as those that are now in the AES, particularly the countries that had been colonized by France, were kind of dealt a very heavy hand in the process of flag independence. So you mentioned the word neocolonialism. It's a concept that people like Kwame Nkrumah spoke a lot about, because it deals with the reality where you get to have your own flag and you get to have a president that looks like you. But the actual kind of wealth of the country, the question of the economic future of the country, continues to be in the hands of the colonizers or neo-colonizers. So we've seen this. Again, there are various examples of this. One I've given around the kind of uranium, but that's just one of the many natural resources. Gold, various other natural resources continued to frankly be robbed broad daylight from these countries and their people. And the kind of CFA franc, which is a kind of arrangement that was enforced on these people at the point of independence, where 50% of the foreign reserves of the currencies of those countries have to be kept in the Bank of France. I mean, this is effectively a colonial tax that was continuing and in some cases continues until today. And lastly, I mean, these kind of special cooperation agreements, etc. So what we were confronted by, with what the AES was confronted by, is really an ongoing colonial relationship. And it is that which is being broken. And this has happened in various ways. I mean, key sectors of economies have been nationalized. There are talks of creating a currency that breaks from the CFA franc. But I think there have been ways in which there have been attempts to really confront the long legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism in very concrete and material terms for people. So when I was there a year ago, it was rainy season, there's a flood. A lot of people lost their houses in those floods. What is the first thing that the new government in Niger does? Is it reduces the prices of cement by decree in order to make it possible for people to shift from mud houses to cement structures, which allows people to build the kind of houses that would be more resilient in the context of a flood. So what is the AES doing? I mean, we have to remember, we are talking of countries that had been impoverished by the kind of the imperialist and colonial reality that had confronted them for so long. These were and still are the poorest countries and among the poorest countries in the world. But these steps are really the steps of trying to walk back 500 years of exploitation and oppression, some of which we've discussed, and really you can't summarize all of this, but that is the kind of ways in which there is a hope that we are able to really change course and move towards a future where, again, it's not just about deciding and sovereignty, but it's also about saying that the actual material conditions of people need to improve. Their safety must be increased, and their actual material ability to make a dignified living has to be increased.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of safety, Jonis, because this has been one of the other major issues in the headlines. Is these countries have, of course, kicked out France, in the case of Niger, also the United States, and they're working towards more of a harmonization amongst themselves in terms of working together in military force, but also have brought in Russia to assist in certain areas as it concerns the military. So I was hoping you could talk more about, this sort of new paradigm of security and what makes it different from what we saw before with the long sort of French and G5 type arrangements.
Sure. Again, this is a question I think many people have been talking about, and I'd like to really start by saying that there's really two big threats that are confronting, or types of threats confronting the AES. One is the one that we have actually been talking about for some time, which is the fact that these countries continue to be, I mean, the AES was formed in response to a threat of foreign military intervention. So there is still the kind of like, and this is not just the kind of military intervention threat, it's also the threat that comes with the economic sanctions, it's the threat that comes with the kind of attempts to diplomatically isolate these countries, etc. But the other threat, it continues to be one that, again, hasn't been created by the peoples of these countries, but the threat of insurgent groups, jihadist groups, etc. So there are a few things that have been that these countries have done. Of course, they formed the alliance, which says that basically an attack on one is an attack on all. They have gone and sought partners that are able to bring things to the table they might not have. They will work with Russia and sign agreements that allow Russian expertise, Russian skills, Russian equipment to participate in the process of bringing peace and security to these countries. But I think the point that is important here is that the strategy is being driven by these AES countries. They are the ones that are the protagonists of the question of security. And again, it's a long road ahead. We don't have a success story that we are talking about today. There's a need to undo a lot of damage that followed not just the last decade post the destruction of Libya, but again, several centuries of really undermining these countries. So, but in that, they have not only gone and arranged partnerships with people outside the AES and among one another. In countries like Burkina Faso, the actual population has been mobilized. So there are many avenues that are being explored in order to say that we want to be able to craft a future where we are not under constant threat, neither by external intervention nor by internal disruptions. And I think this is fundamentally opposed to what we have seen up until the creation of the AES. Because let's be clear that what France was providing there was not security. If you have a 2,000-fold percentage point increase in deaths thanks to insurgent activity, then you are not bringing peace and stability to the region. So what were we dealing with up until now, or up until the creation of the AES? Well, we were dealing with France that had a strategy to which the AES, the countries that are now in the AES, were really subservient. So this was about creating the conditions where these countries are destabilized to the point where it is easy to extract the mineral resources. When I am worried that I might get killed in the street, then maybe I'm not going to organize against the fact that all the country's wealth is being plundered. So one element of what was the French strategy there, it had nothing to do with peace and stability. It was about creating the kind of destabilization that is functional for the exploitative relationships that continue to exist. The second element of what we now know France was doing, and we know now that they were in many cases not trying to subdue insurgent activity, but they were fueling the fire there and making things worse. Part of the reason for that has to do with the strategy of creating effectively a war zone across the Sahel to reduce migration from sub-Saharan Africa towards Europe. Again, me who is sitting in South Africa, who is looking for a better life because the economic conditions in my country have been terrible for centuries and for generations, I might think twice about migrating across the already very dangerous Sahara Desert and getting onto a boat and crossing the Mediterranean if I first have to brave a kind of war zone in the Sahel. And that war zone, again, it served a purpose, and it served a purpose of kind of NATO strategy, of imperialist strategy, and the peoples of the Sahel, the governments of the Sahel were really pawns in that game. So It's a fundamental difference. Again, we're not talking about a success story, but we are talking about a story where the future of that region, of these countries, the security of those people is finally in the hands of those people and of the people that they have confidence in, and not a kind of an afterthought in the strategy of France for both mineral plunder and the kind of fight against migration.
Mm. Well, Jonis, we really appreciate you joining us here and helping us sort through all of it and all of the fantastic work being done by Pan Africanism Today. I hope everyone is following you, especially on your very, very informative Telegram channel on a very on a regular basis, keeping us up to date on everything happening on the continent. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.